This is the crown jewel, Mr. Good as Gold. This is Connor Hopkins.
I am Eric S. Knight.
And I'm a league champion.
And we are the chosen prodigal sons, and this is the Shotgun Wrestling Radio podcast.
What's up, everybody? It's Leon King here, of course, the baddest of the baddest, and you are now listening to Shotgun Wrestling Radio.
This is Gavin Parker, and you're listening to Shotgun Wrestling Radio.
This is the mechanic Big Beasley, and you are listening to Shotgun Wrestling Radio.
This is your deathmatch daddy Bo guy, and you're watching Shotgun Wrestling Radio.
All right, in 5, 4, 3, 2. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Shotgun Wrestling Radio. I'm your host, Zach Takis, and we're continuing our road to the Hall of Fame weekend in Waterloo, Iowa. At this point, we are now officially less than 1 month away. 1 month from today, we will all be in Waterloo, Iowa, celebrating a wonderful weekend at the George Trails Luthez Hall of Fame Museum in Waterloo. And my guest at this time is actually this year's Jim Melby Award winner, the one and only Mr. Al Getz. Al, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Zach. I'm excited to come on the podcast and talk a little bit about Tragos Thez and wrestling history.
Yeah, and you know what? I've been kind of messaging you back and forth here, especially after listening to your 2 latest podcasts. And I've always found territory wrestling time frame just super interesting because I was born in '86. So by the time I was really becoming a wrestling fan, it was full-fledged WWF. That was kind of the thing, and the territories have died out. But the older I get, the more you learn about the territory system. I just find it incredibly, and it's just an interesting time period. Like, no matter what territory you look at, I just love the fact that a guy like, say, for example, Ted DiBiase can be one thing up here in the central states, while he can go down to Florida and work for Dusty and be something completely different, and nobody would ever know.
Yeah, it was just a different time. The world was a much smaller place. There was no internet. And even, even though there were wrestling magazines, they were usually several months behind. So if something happened in June, it wouldn't be in the magazines until September, and those magazines were dated in November. So, the local promotions had the ability to, tell their own stories, tell their own narratives. And if a wrestler, had been a successful heel all throughout, other places, but they needed a babyface and he was available, they'd say, all right, you're a babyface.
Now, what was it about, territory wrestling for you that got you so interested into it? You wanted to actually start charting it, hence the name, as we see in the background there, charting the territories. What was it about the territories for you that got you so interested?
Well, in addition to being a professional wrestling historian, prior to that, I was actually an independent wrestling manager, which was something I had always wanted to get involved in. And as a kid, you mentioned you were born in '86. I was born in '71. So when I first discovered wrestling, in 11, 12, 13 years old, the territories were still around, and I would read the magazines. And just like you said, I found it fascinating that a wrestler could go to Florida for 6 months, 8 months, a year, and then pack things up and go to Portland for 6 months, 8 months, a year. And really what got me interested in wrestling was that sounded so cool to me. Of course, by the time I actually got into wrestling, the territories had sort of faded away, but I was able to work a lot in the Southeast, but even as far as up north in New Jersey, worked for Burt Prentice in Tennessee in the late '90s, even made it all the way out to California to work for Roland Alexander's All Pro Wrestling. So I just found it so cool that you could literally just, pack up the car and go somewhere and live there for 6 months and then move somewhere else.
Now, what was then again, what led it to you actually wanting to actually start charting it? Because you go to your website and you just have so much detail on these charts, and it's just really fascinating to look at and read. What was it about that made you? Was it kind of just more of the historical aspect that you wanted to kind of try tracking better that hadn't really been done before?
Well, yeah, and that website, which you mentioned, and we'll give it a quick plug here, chartingtheterritories.com. It really came about from one of my other big loves, which is baseball. And in baseball, there are a wealth of statistics available. Even back then, there obviously wasn't the things we have access to now, but there were stats for every baseball player. Obviously, you know how many home runs Derek Jeter or Barry Bonds or Hank Aaron hit. You know how many times Nolan Ryan threw no hitters. But what about the guys that weren't Hall of Famers and weren't all-stars? We still know their batting average, the number of games they played and the number of home runs they hit. So the idea behind charting the territories was to try and come up with some statistics that could be applied to all wrestlers and come up with what I call back of the baseball card stats for professional wrestlers. Because, before this, all we knew was, okay, Bruno Sammartino sold out the Garden this many times. Ric Flair held the World Heavyweight title this many times. You didn't really know anything about the other guys, the mid-carders and the preliminary wrestlers who made careers out of professional wrestling, and they deserve their flowers. They deserve to have some sort of a stat line.
Now, the other thing that I found interesting too, and I know we're kind of jumping all over here, I had mentioned to you, me being from Iowa, Cedar Rapids specifically, I figured Cedar Rapids were 4 short hours away from Minnesota. I figured for sure we would have been AWA territory, and you were actually flying up to correct me on that, which that just kind of shocked me a little bit. I thought Cedar Rapids would have been prime time AWA territory for us.
Well, and one of the interesting things as I study the territories is there were no set answers. There's not a specific, book like the NWA had where they said, okay, this longitude and latitude point belongs to this territory, and then it goes south this many miles and east. And really, when you understand the things that happened to make the territories viable, so before there was television, basically some promoters set up shop in the largest metropolitan areas in the country. So think about Minneapolis, St. Paul, Kansas City, Oklahoma City, St. Louis, Dallas, and extending in all directions. Over time, and so basically a promoter would set up shop in one of those major cities, and realistically, you can take a compass. Remember in school when you had the compass to draw circles? You literally stick the pin in the middle and draw a radius such that it never gets closer to the next major city than you. And so they would all draw circles around. And then over time, with the advent of television, people that lived, say, halfway between Chicago and Minneapolis, for example, they might not have had a local TV station. They might have gotten a station from the largest city in Minneapolis and a signal from the largest station in Chicago. But over time, so let's take Davenport and Moline, Davenport, Iowa, Moline, Illinois, Rock Island. At some point, they probably got a local station and it did well enough. And then the population grew enough that they added a second local station. And at some point, one of the promoters, either Vern in Minnesota or somewhere down south, said, well, now we can get our TV on in Davenport and start running shows there. So there's probably just some sort of loose understanding as far as who would go in there first. And maybe sometimes the promoters disagreed. But also there's it's about demographics. And is Iowa culturally more similar to Minneapolis or to Kansas City? I don't know enough about the area, but you might. But another example in my research learning about Louisiana, northern Louisiana, Shreveport and Monroe, are much more culturally similar to Arkansas and Oklahoma than they are to southern Louisiana, which is Baton Rouge and New Orleans, which has a lot more in common with Mississippi and Alabama. So it has to do with a lot of study of the demographics, and each promoter had their own style of wrestling. Vern knew what worked in Minneapolis. Gus Karras knew what worked in Missouri and Kansas. So it's a matter of discovering, okay, of these cities in Iowa, which of these two promotions is it more culturally similar to? That was a long answer. Sorry.
No, that's great. I love it. It makes me talk less, which is great. So now, eventually, you decided to start, writing books and publishing books. What's been the most, I guess, interesting experience for you from what have you learned the most about, when it comes to publishing all these books?
Well, I've literally learned how to publish a book, how to write a book, how to design a book, how to lay out a book, how to publish it, how to market it. I've done it all. It's easy to slap things on a website. It's easy to have a podcast. And of course, cheap plug alert, we do have a monthly podcast called Charting the Territories that comes out the second Thursday of every month. But
Great podcast, by the way.
Why, thank you. But to put everything into a book, it's just another level of dedication. It's also with the website, it's me putting out the things I want to put out. And the books, and you can see in this background, there are 4, although a 5th one is coming out during Trago's Thez weekend. It's actually going to be when it's released. Each one has been better than the next because I've listened to feedback and reviews from the people who bought it. And they say, I like this book, but it'd be better if this. And I don't use every suggestion. In fact, some of them are no-goes, but a lot of people have had some really good ideas and suggestions. And so I truly feel that each book is better than the previous one. But at the same time, if I hadn't published the first book, which I would love to redo, now that I have a little more idea of what people are looking for, I would love to do a revised edition. But if I hadn't put that first book out, we never would have gotten to step 5, the 5th book, which is so much better than it, because I needed to take that first leap and say, I'm going to publish a book. Hopefully somebody will buy it, but even if they don't, I want to put this all together in a format that is easily digestible by wrestling fans.
Now, I know you were at the Hall of Fame weekend last year. Was last year your first time attending the event, or
that was my second time? I went in 2021 and again in 2023, and obviously I'll be there this year. But this time I will be an honored guest. Here's something I thought about today, which is really cool. As a kid, as a teenager, I listened to Tony Schiavone every week for many, many years, and of course, more recently, I listened to him not every week, but occasionally. On July, let's see, the award ceremony is the second day. So on July 19th, for at least a few minutes, Tony Schiavone is going to be listening to me. How cool is that?
That is super cool. That is, I got the pleasure of being inducted into part of the Hall of Fame for Central Empire Wrestling last year at their big Bridge City Slam event. And during the ceremony, Earl Hebner was there, and I got done after we got done. I looked at the promoter. I'm like, if you would have told me Earl Hebner was going to be here, I might have prepared a little bit better. Not very often you get a speech of a guy in front of that kind of caliber, so I know how you're feeling.
But to me, I'd be even more nervous knowing he was there. It actually might be better to just have total ignorance and just do your thing and not overthink it and over-prepare it. As a wrestling manager, I learned the more I planned a promo ahead of time, the worse it was. You just got to get a feel for your character and the storyline and then just feed off the crowd's energy. So obviously, of course, if you're doing it and you hear Earl Hebner heckling you, then maybe you might want to change the speech, but he probably wouldn't have done that.
Well, even a lot of times, this podcast in particular, we've been doing it since 2010. My co-host passed away in 2020, right before COVID hit, and I picked it back up again later on in the year. And then I've kind of gotten to the point too where I don't really prepare a whole. I'll do a lot of research, sure. I might prepare some things, but I always kind of just go with the flow of the interview kind of type of thing. I might not always stick to the script, and a lot of times too, and I've told people this, sometimes I'll have 5 or 6 questions written out. Sometimes we only get to 3 of them because the conversation's going so good that's all you need your main focus to be.
Or in the course of them answering the question, it either leads you down a different path or gives you the idea of a follow-up question to ask that wasn't on the list. So sometimes you just got to wing it, Zach.
Absolutely. Now, so you've had a couple years experience now at the Hall of Fame. I've been going since 2012. What for you has been, I guess, the most exciting parts of these weekends? What is it for you that you've enjoyed so much that keeps bringing you back?
I think the fact that it's a smaller event. I've been to Cauliflower Alley, and that's a little more large scale. I've been to some of the big conventions around there, and those are just madhouses. So here it's a much more intimate gathering because it's because it's in the middle of nowhere. No offense to Waterloo, Iowa, but hard to get a direct flight to Waterloo from Atlanta. There's maybe one a day. But because of that, it brings out the more dedicated fans, and most of them are probably similar age-wise to you, but they have they have an interest in the time before that era, before, they were watching wrestling. They want to, they want to talk to Thunderbolt Patterson, Gerald Briscoe, Bob Roop, all the legends that are there every year, even the ones that aren't getting awards. It seems like they come back year after year. I know Bill DeMott was there for the first time last year because he received an award, but he's coming back again this year. And so if the wrestlers were happy enough with how things went to go back, even when they're not an honored guest, that really tells you something. So I just enjoyed my two experiences immensely. And of course, even if I didn't want to go back, I had to because I'm getting an award. But I'm absolutely thrilled to go back, and I will probably be a regular year in, year out until who knows.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you mentioned like the small environments. That's something I feel like every time I do these Road to Hall of Fame weekend series, I've been doing it for the last several years here, and that's one thing we all really love about it. It's such a tight knit group. It's everything is like Chad Olson said last week on the show. You can park your car in the parking garage across from the hotel, and you don't need to move your car the rest of the weekend.
Yep. Yeah, everything is within walking distance.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it's great. The Hall of Fame, the Convention Center, everything.
You never know who's going to be in the room next year. I remember one year Bob Backlund was there. I think it was 21, maybe 2019. Bob Backlund was there. I remember walking out towards the elevator. And I walked past Bob Backlund, and his room door was open. All of a sudden, I kind of went over. There he is getting a workout in. I'm like, yeah, that's Bob.
That's Bob. Yeah.
And even when he was at the museum, I saw him doing step ups on the as you go into the right where they have the wrestling mats there and they had the bleachers. I saw Bob doing step ups on the bleachers there. I'm like, he never stops working out.
No, he doesn't. And I mean, it shows. He still looks great. He's still in great shape.
Yeah. Still looks like he could put on one hell of a cross-faced chicken wing. That's for damn sure.
Yep.
So when
I know Baron von Raschke put I think he put the claw on my good friend Captain Midnight Guthrie last year.
And I know Midnight, as much as he might have hated it, I know deep down he probably loved it though, knowing Midnight as well as I do.
So I'll tell a story. Obviously, we're here to talk about my work as a historian, but I want to tell a story about my time as wrestling manager because it's similar to that. In probably about 2000, 2001, I worked a show with Captain Lou Albano, who was managing the baby faces, and I was managing the heels. Albano had a cane. He could barely walk. And I said, I don't care. You stand there and I will run into you and you just hold out your fist and I will bump like you punched me. Because there was no way I was going to work against Captain Lou Albano and not take a big bump for him out of respect for his body of work over the years.
Yeah, that has to be one heck of a moment. That's the other thing I love about these shows too, the Hall of Fame. There for years we were doing the Legends Lumberjack match where all the legends get around the ring and there's a big giant lumberjack. And yeah, I know guys like Baron and all those guys just love somehow, some way getting involved. Doesn't matter if it's just throwing a punch to somebody, but it's always so much fun to see them still getting involved. And yeah, I'm curious to see this year because we changed up the days a little bit. We moved the ceremony to Friday night, which I found kind of interesting. I'm curious to see how that goes. And then we got the wrestling show Saturday this year. So I'll just be curious to see how the flow of that all goes this year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be a different spin on it, but I know they released the lineup for the Impact Pro Wrestling show on Saturday night, and there's some good matches going on there. I see Rock Riddle is wrestling a match.
How about that?
I hope they've got some defibrillators and an ambulance on standby, not for Rock, but for his opponent, because I think he's going to unload years and years of frustration out on whoever he's facing.
Yeah, that's going to be fun. And then I know the other match they had that was kind of the marquee was Brock Anderson versus Wes Briscoe with Jerry in Wes's corner and Arn in Brock's corner. So that's kind of fun. Talk about family history there, the Andersons and the Briscoes. Wow.
Yeah, that's a couple of great legendary wrestling families, and then they're going to be in Iowa. What's another neat thing about Waterloo, Iowa, is that it's literally where the National Wrestling Alliance was formed. They met in the hotel there that and signed the paperwork to form the NWA. So plus it was one of ABBA's greatest songs was Waterloo. So the birthplace of the NWA and a great pop song from the 70s.
Now, when you actually got told that you were going to receive the Jim Melby Award for this year's event, what was kind of running through your mind?
It's funny. I was actually, so it was in December. It was around Christmas time, and I was in New York visiting family. So I was actually out to dinner with my mom, and I got a message on Facebook from Chad Olson wanting to know if he could give me a phone call later that evening. And so I was like, all right, no one calls anybody on the phone anymore. This must be something big. And I at that time, I was surprised. I wasn't expecting it, but when he said if he could call me, I sort of figured that's what it was. I was blown away. I actually, for one of the first times in my life, I was speechless for a good couple of minutes. But I actually, I looked at the list of prior award winners. They've been giving the award out since 2006. And I mean, about half the people on this list have been wrestling historians for almost as long as I've been alive. You look at guys like, of course, Jim Melby, even Mike Mooneyham, J. Michael Kenyon, Apter, Napolitano, Koji Miyamoto, Tom Burke, who was last year's recipient. I mean, Tom Burke was already in the newsletter game before I was born, which was in 1971. So to be on the same list as these people is really mind-blowing to me. And I almost feel like I don't deserve it, but I think because I don't just catalog wrestling history by finding things and posting them, but I actually take that information and do something with it, do something that hasn't been done before. We mentioned earlier the statistics I use, but also a lot of times we use the information we find to figure out if the wrestlers are telling the truth in their shoot interviews. And surprise, surprise, sometimes they embellish in the things they say. And so sometimes it's pretty neat to go, well, actually, you weren't in the main event every single night of your career, and it wasn't always a sellout. But
Now, I know you said you got the new book coming out, so let's talk a little bit about that. I believe it covers the central part of the U.S. is what your
it's going to cover what most people call Central States Wrestling. The actual name of the company was Heart of America Sports Attractions, but this is the promotion that was based out of Kansas City and ran cards in Kansas, most of Missouri, and a large chunk of Iowa. It actually even extended all the way into the western part of Illinois. Quincy, Illinois was run about once a month. But we're going to cover it from 1974 through 1976. One of my first few books covered it from 71 through 73, and that's 73 was the year that Harley Race was given the short world title reign in between Dory Jr. and Jack Briscoe. And what you see in the mid 70s is he's not in the territory as much as he had been, because now that he's a big star, a former world champion, he's in demand all over the country and all over the world. So what's interesting is they use two local young wrestlers to try and fill the shoes of Harley Race, and also guys like Bob Geigel and Pat O'Connor are winding down their in-ring career. So they actually take a rookie from St. Joseph by the name of Mike George and build him up through 73 and 74, and he becomes one of their top stars. And then another youngster also from St. Joseph, Ed Wiskoski, before he became Colonel De Beers, came in. And what's interesting is, even though he grew up in St. Joseph and was a legitimate, football star there, he's a heel working in his home area. So and really, that's when you know you're a good wrestler, is when you can play heel in front of fans that probably went to high school with you and know you or know your family. And if you can still get them mad at you, that's a sign you've done good. But it's just interesting to see the changes the territory made. We also have the first matches in the career of Jesse Ventura, and some of the earliest matches in the careers of both Roddy Piper and Robert Gibson took place in Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas.
Now, I know, again, this is coming out during Hall of Fame weekend. Will us fine folks in Iowa be able to get to purchase this along with your other books?
Yes, I will have. I'm planning on having all of my books available at the Tragos. There's a slight chance it may only be the two books about Heart of America Central States. It all depends on how many of these I can cram into a suitcase along with a couple of days worth of clothes, and figuring out how to ship the rest out there. But the book is actually going to be available worldwide the Monday after Tragos Thes. So that would be the 22nd of July. But I will have copies in Waterloo for people at Tragos Thes, and I'm even going to autograph the thing for every customer that wants it. Although I've heard it actually decreases the value of the book to have me sign it. So it's up to the person. If they don't want me to sign it, I understand completely. But you could take the, you could buy the book early in the weekend and then take it around to all the wrestlers and get them to sign it as well.
Now, again, this is the new book coming out. Have you started planning or started outlining your next book? Because again, the territories cover so much, and the thing that's cool what you do is you're only covering like certain time periods. So I feel like you can just keep continuing to do this, further and further down the line.
And at one point that was the plan. Right now, I'm not sure what the next move is going to be. The territories I've covered so far, which are Central States, Gulf Coast Championship Wrestling, and then Lyra McGurk's territory, are three of the most discussed or underappreciated territories of the era. Of course, everybody knows about Florida, Georgia, Jim Crockett Promotions, the WWF, Portland, Southern California. This sort of area, sort of in the center of the country, from Iowa all the way down, to Louisiana, really doesn't get talked about as much. So the idea of these first few books was to get them, put them in writing. From there, I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go next, but as you said, there's a lot of flexibility. I can stay in these same territories and cover different time periods, or I can go to different territories covering the same time periods.
Very cool, very cool. And again, talking about territories, I assume you are familiar with the Death of the Territories book. I was just curious to see if you have read that and what your kind of thoughts are. I read that a couple years ago here once we were all sitting at home and we had nothing better to do, and I finally had picked that one up to read because it was, again, territory time frame just interesting to me. So I found it interesting. I didn't really find anything, I guess, too surprising. I was just curious to see what your thoughts on that particular book were.
And I'm the same way. There was nothing, shocking or no shocking revelations, but at the same time, he did a great job of weaving all the stories of all the different territories and the reasons they failed, because everyone's talking about the Vice series, who killed WCW. The true answer is a series of events that were all happened within a short period of time that were unrelated to one another. And the same thing with the Death of the Territories. There's obviously a very big thing, and that is Vince's national expansion. But aside from that, even before then, some of the territories like big time wrestling in Detroit and the California territories had already sort of faded away. So again, it's a series of unrelated events that take place over a span of about 5 or 6 years, maybe even a little longer, that leads to a new system taking the place of the territorial system. But Tim does a great job in weaving all those different stories and all those different places together into one book.
Well, the one thing that I kind of kept...
When I move my hands, you can sometimes see the light fixture behind me, because that's not a real background. That's an image I have. So there you go. There's a little behind the scenes. There's a green screen theme going on here.
The one thing that I kind of took away from it too is, if you really wanted to blame, I guess, kind of one thing, I'd say it would definitely be the expansion of cable, even because as cable became more prominent in all of our lives, that was going to be more and more viewership, which for these smaller promotions were, like we said earlier, a Ted DiBiase could go down to Florida and be somebody different for 6 months and then go back up to Minnesota. Nobody would have a clue what he did in Florida unless they were getting magazines or dirt sheets.
Right. And it's very interesting because if you remember at the beginning of this podcast, I alluded to the thing that made the territories viable was another development in television, and that was the idea of local regional television. It was no longer just the Dumont network showing Gorgeous George and Vern Gagne. It was regional companies have a local televised product. So really the territorial era is sandwiched between two major technological changes in television. And that is from regional television through the cable era is what made the territories able to thrive. And then of course, what led to their demise.
So let's talk about too, you had mentioned earlier, you have your own podcast called Charting the Territories. How did this little project come about for you? I've obviously kind of an audio version of the book, and you're able to do a lot more fun things. I enjoy the quiz section of the show. I also enjoy the what did you learn this month? I think that's kind of a fun little feature. How'd you guys, real quick, we got 10 minutes left here. How'd you guys come up with this project?
I had been doing the website for a couple of years, and it was pretty obvious that in order to grow traffic or awareness, I needed to do a podcast. And it's very funny. I had never met my co-host, John Boucher. I had never even talked to him, but we followed one another on Twitter, and I found his views on wrestling, what he liked, and also his views on baseball and music very aligned with me. So I sent him a direct message out of the blue, and I literally said, look, we don't know each other, but I'm looking to start a podcast, and for some reason, I think you'd be the perfect co-host. Are you interested? And he says, sure. And the rest give it life. And really, John has sort of breathed life into it with his storytelling and his knowledge of history. So what we sort of do is each month we cover a different territory, and we sort of run through the roster, and both John and I name some interesting fun facts about the wrestlers that hopefully our listeners haven't heard of. It's not just the same things that everybody knows about the same wrestlers, but we cover them all. We played Gordon Soley's wrestling trivia game from the 80s. And as you mentioned, we each name one new thing that we learned over the course of our research over the month.
Again, Charting the Territories podcast, go ahead and check it out. It's a once-a-month podcast. This month, you guys had Ian Riccaboni as part of the quiz show that you guys do every month. Last month, you guys had Chad Olson on the quiz show, and Chad actually won his quiz round, which is kind of nice because your co-host. If I'm gonna be doing the trivia Thursday night, I might need to find your co-host to be on his trivia team Thursday night.
I would strongly recommend that, but I think John might have revenge on his mind if he.
Oh, I think we're freezing again here.
To Waterloo, I think Chad.
So, well, apparently my internet connection is not playing nice now, or vice versa. But Al, hey, thank you very much, man, for joining me on the podcast here this week. Tell everybody real quick where they can follow you at.
You can follow me on Twitter/X at AlGetz Wrestling. That's AlGetz Wrestling. You can also go to chartingtheterritories.com, and you can find our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Charting the Territories AlGetz.
And there you have it. Again, come see Al this coming July in Waterloo, Iowa, as he receives the Jim Melby Award winner this coming July. It's going to be a great weekend. It's going to be a lot of fun. Al, thank you very much for joining me here this week on the pod. And guys, until next time, we will see you right here on the World Wide Web.